Hi everyone, and welcome to our presentation. Today we're going to take a look at the question, should behaviorism shape educational practices? First, let's start off by going over our presentation outline. We're going to start off with our 3 essential questions, followed by our key terms and definitions that'll be important for you to know as we go through the content of this presentation, types of behaviorism, the history of behaviorism, those that are pro-behaviorism and its application to education, those that are anti-behaviorism and how it affects education, current behaviorism research, the pros and cons of behaviorism in education, and we'll finish up with our activity for you and our references. So our 3 essential questions are, how is behaviorism used in education to help shape student outcomes? How does behaviorism affect our educational practices? And does behaviorism in education increase or decrease student success? Our key terms that are important for you to know are learning, which is the process in which experiences cause permanent change in knowledge or behavior. Behavior, which is anything that someone does that can be observed, measured, and repeated. Behaviorism, which is a learning theory that focuses on behaviors that are observable. Behavioral learning theory, which are explanations of learning that focus on external events that cause changes in behavior. Stimuli, which is an event that initiates a behavior. A response, which is a reaction to a stimuli. So this stimuli and response connection is going to be really important throughout this presentation and understanding its effects on behavior and education. So really think about stimuli as being the initial thing that happens. So for instance, you give a math test. That will be your stimuli. And your reaction will be how your student acts after you give them that test. So there might be various different responses. Someone might rip a test. Someone may sit down quietly and start taking the test. That relationship is going to be really important for us as we go through here. Classical conditioning, which is really our first type of behaviorism that we took a look at in history, and we'll explain more about as we go through. And it's a practice in which associations are made with new stimuli. Consequences, which is a response that follows a behavior. Reinforcement, which is the use of consequences to strengthen behavior. And we have 2 different reinforcement types that we'll be talking about. The first one being positive reinforcement, which is the addition of a stimuli to strengthen behavior, and negative reinforcement, which is the taking away of a stimuli to strengthen behavior. And lastly, for our key terms, we have operant conditioning, which is a method of learning through the use of reinforcers and punishers. So our 3 types of behaviorism. The first one being methodological behaviorism. This is the most simplistic type out of the 3, and it's an explanation of behaviors based solely on observable stimuli and response. So just looking at when a stimuli is introduced, what that response is. The second one is called psychological or radical behaviorism. Now we're going to get a little bit more complex with the introduction of reinforcements. And this type of behaviorism is an explanation of behaviors based on external stimuli, responses, learning history, and reinforcements. And lastly, we have logical or analytical behaviorism, which is an explanation of learning that says that the mental state is the idea of behavioral tendencies. So here we have a nice diagram and timeline for you of kind of the history of behaviorism, where we started and where we are today. We're going to be talking about 4 out of the 6 parts of this timeline today. First, starting off with Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment done in the 1890s with dog salivation. Then moving on to 1920 with John Watson, who did his famous Little Albert experiment. Then we'll move on to 1938 with B.F. Skinner. He had an operant conditioning experiment using a rat. And then we'll talk about most recently in 1971, Albert Bandura's social learning theory. So pro-behaviorism, let's take a look at the researchers and theorists that were pro-behaviorism. And those would be Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and Albert Bandura. So the first real pioneer or researcher that started the behaviorism train, if you will, was Ivan Pavlov. And in 1890, he began experimenting and researching dog salvation through classical conditioning. And this was really one of the first stepping stones in behaviorism. And he worked to really pair a stimuli to a response. And he did this by using dogs and dog food. So he demonstrated that when a bowl of dog food was introduced to a dog, which would be a stimuli, he could trigger an unconditioned response and the dog would salivate. And over time, he was able to create this association between the dog food and the dog salivating. And then he decided to introduce a bell as a neutral stimulus. And so when he introduced the bowl of food, he would also ring a bell. And over time, the dog was conditioned that when he heard the bell, whether there was food introduced or not, he would automatically begin to salivate. So that was really the first real instance of classical conditioning and the power that we have to condition humans and people to change behavior. And at the bottom of this slide, there is a YouTube video that you're free to watch that will give you more information on Ivan Pavlov and his research. So the application of Pavlov's theory in education. So through Pavlov's theory, researchers discovered that a stimulus can be used to condition humans and animals to respond in a particular way. And this is also known as classical conditioning, which we've talked about. And we can use classical conditioning in education by conditioning students to respond in a specific way when a particular stimuli is introduced. A classic example of this would be we have conditioned our students that when a bell rings at school, they know they need to be in class. So that bell being the stimuli, they respond by making sure that they are in class. The second person we're going to talk about is John Watson, and he is known for his research in child rearing, animal behavior, and advertising. And he took a look at methodological behaviorism. He also wrote an article titled Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, and that was really his claim to fame as him describing his new philosophy on behaviorism. And he believed that a child's environment is a factor that shapes its behaviors. And he did this through an experiment called the Little Albert experiment. And it was a very controversial research experiment that was done, but Watson wanted to show how you could condition someone to be afraid of something. So what he did is he took an 11-month-old baby, and that baby was allowed to play with various types of animals, such as rats and rabbits. And the baby initially wasn't afraid, was happily playing with them. But then Watson began pairing a loud noise to when the child touched a specific animal. So for instance, every time the baby touched a rat, Watson would pair a loud noise to the rat. And over time, the baby was conditioned to be afraid of that animal. So that really showed us, too, the power of conditioning and how we can really change a behavior depending upon our stimulus and response relationship. So the application of Watson's theory in education. So John Watson believed that people can create a connection between a stimulus and a response by reinforcing the response when the stimuli is introduced. So examples of this in education is that if a student is bullied at school, then they may start to associate fear and school together. On the positive side, a student earns candy if they get perfect attendance for a year. The student may then associate coming to school with happiness. Right behind John Watson is B.F. Skinner, who was highly influenced by John Watson's research. And Skinner was a powerful force that brought behaviorism into classroom instruction. He used radical behaviorism, with reinforcement being a key element. And he did say that he did not believe in punishment, but instead reinforcing the behaviors we want. So instead of punishing the behaviors that we don't want, to really just focus and reinforce on the behaviors that we do want and the effectiveness of that. And he used operant conditioning, using a stimuli and response in conjunction with positive and negative reinforcers. And what he did was he placed a rat in a cage, and when the rat figured out that a part of the cage had a special bar, when he pushed that bar, it would dispense food. And over time, the rat was conditioned that by pressing the bar, food would be given. And over time, the rat was able to learn that. And so Skinner believed that behaviors were shaped by the environment around us, and if we shape the environment, then it would in turn shape us. And at the bottom of this slide, there's a video that you can take a look at too, that will give you some more additional information on B.F. Skinner and his research. The application of Skinner's theory in education. So B.F. Skinner's theory of utilizing positive and negative reinforcers when a stimulus is presented is utilized in the world of education every day. And an example of this would be giving students a reward after completing an academic assignment. So once again, our stimuli would be the academic assignment, our reinforcer would be the reward, and hopefully our response would be that the child completes the academic assignment that we want them to finish. Most recently, we have Albert Bandura, and he came up with the social learning theory, which says that behaviors are learned through reciprocal interactions among behavioral and environmental influences. So he was really big on modeling and observational learning. And he said, quote, "Learning would be exceedingly laborious, not to mention hazardous, if people had to rely solely on the effects of their own actions to inform them what to do." And he really believed that observational learning is the most important way in which people learn expected behavior. The application of Albert Bandura's theory in education. So behavior is learned through modeling and observational learning, according to Bandura. And over time, children will imitate the behaviors that they are observing over and over again. And I think if you think back, you can probably come up with some examples of this at work. Some examples in the classroom could be a teacher begins a sentence with a capital letter every time they're writing a sentence, and a student will begin doing that as well through the observation and modeling. Another example is a teacher is calm when the computer is not working. A student will remain calm when something doesn't go their way either, because that's what they're seeing as a reaction. Now let's take a look at the anti-behaviorism side of this debate. So Carl Rogers was the one that kind of theorized that when working with people, we should be looking at the person as a whole, including their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and not just by looking at their behaviors and what we see. So Rogers thought that each person is self-actualizing and needs to grow and have freedom from the outside environment. Rogers also said that an educator can encourage a student, but that the student must be self-driven to learn. So really thinking about the person as a whole and not just by what we can see on the outside. So some behaviorism theories and how they're applied in the classroom. One major one that I know is used in schools and school districts around the country right now is PBIS, which stands for Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. It is research-based, and it's a theory based off of John Watson's work as well as Edward Thorndike's work. And what happens with this system is when a student does a desired acceptable behavior, we provide them with a positive reinforcement. And the student will want to continue to do the desired behavior to continue to receive the positive reinforcement. So I know the school that I work in, we use PBIS as a school-wide initiative, and we've come up with 4 characteristics that we really want our kids to have. And we reinforce them with different games and activities each month when they're caught doing what we want them to do. And so if you want to learn more about this, you can take a look at the YouTube video at the bottom of the screen, and it'll give you more in-depth information about PBIS. Some other techniques that are used in the classroom that are based off of these theories are behavior modification, or an individualized behavior plan, which is written based off of targeted behaviors that we want our kids to have or change. Token economy, so that would be earning rewards or stickers or something like that after doing a behavior that we want them to do. A response cost, which would be a removal of a stimulus. Or we could use ignoring of undesired behaviors in order to lessen them, which is also called planned ignoring. So we use operant conditioning in the classroom and positive reinforcement to increase attention and participation all the time. You may not even notice that you're doing it, but there are a lot of ways in which we use behaviorism in schools. Current research. So we used widely in education, especially with kiddos with autism spectrum disorders. We use a lot of ABA or VB, which are applied behavioral analysis or verbal behavior. And we use these principles of operant and classical conditioning that we've talked about in order to change behaviors that we don't want students to have, or to reinforce behaviors that we do want students to have. And it shares the viewpoints of radical behaviorism. So what are the strengths of behaviorism in the classroom? So it allows us for cueing responses to behaviors to allow for a learner to respond to a stimulus in a predictable way. It's objective, and it allows for its outcomes for learning to be set and for expectations for students to be known. These behavioral theories can also shape student behavior to allow for specific responses to an educator's teaching methods. So I know one that comes to mind for me is the call and response phrases that we use in schools. A teacher may say half of a response, and the students are trained over time to finish the response, and it's easy for them to get students' attention or to stop them from what they're doing. Behaviorism also allows for educators to observe and measure behaviors and shape these behaviors to what the educator wants. Behaviorism is used in a variety of therapies to help students, and they are real-life applications of behaviorism that we use every day. The limitations of behaviorism in the classroom. So behaviorism does take away a lot of options for students to make their own choices, and it gives adults the authority to decide whether a behavior is going to be reinforced or not. And a lot of the time, adults have different opinions on behaviors, so that could change between adults and can be confusing for kids sometimes. Behaviorism does not take into account thought process or mental states because we're only looking at what we can see and measure and not necessarily what's going on in the mind. And lastly, it assumes that we don't have personal beliefs, which we all do, and sometimes we let those personal beliefs affect what we want our children to do. So our behaviorism activity. So what we would like for you to do is choose a problem that you have seen or frequently see in the educational classroom or system, and to create a behavioral plan using whichever type of conditioning, classical or operant, that you would like to change the problem and shape it to create an outcome of your choice. So for instance, I have a student that frequently shouts out in the middle of class. I would reinforce the student every 10 minutes with a piece of candy for not shouting out. That would be an example of behavior modification that you could think of. We also have our academic references here for you, as well as our photo and video references.